the most significant movements of thought that we study at St. John's particularly falls along the division of ancients and moderns. It's pretty easy to distinguish a strong difference between the thought of Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles and Aeschylus, who grant the certainty of a supersensual realm and of the transcendent existence of truth, beauty, goodness. And then on the other hand, you have the camp of the moderns. And the moderns begin arguably with Descartes, although I think it's an ongoing question. As you enter the moderns, you start to look back and ask, was Aquinas a modern in the sense that he's moving away from these transcendent ideas, the forms of the eidos of Plato, and towards more practical approaches to philosophy. By the time you get to Bacon, there's almost a battle line drawn where the ancients have been largely rejected, and philosophy has to have a new founding. And it's specifically become natural philosophy. The concern is, how do we order the material world along lines that are conducive to human life? And that approach to philosophy remains throughout, really at least until Heidegger. And so you see a questioning about what the fundamental difference is between ancients and moderns, but also how the modern project changes. It seems in many respects the ancients have kind of a wholeness to them. They all seem to be, although they do disagree with each other, there's a kind of a shared vision. But among the moderns, it's not as clear. There are similarities between Bacon and Machiavelli and Descartes, but it's not as clearly delineated. You can see Hobbes' intellectual inheritance from Machiavelli and Bacon, but what he does with it is very much his own. And so then an element of historicism enters into the picture, and I think that culminates in senior year with Hegel, and so you finally have a moment when you can look back on what you've been doing at St. John's and say, do I agree with how Hegel is presenting this narrative of Western thought, or do I see it in other terms? Do I interpret the Greeks, for instance, as a kind of naive childhood of the world and of philosophy, or do I see it differently? So historicism becomes really, I think, a real question, particularly as you move towards the end. And then finally with Heidegger, I think the whole project is really called into question, and in Nietzsche to some extent too, although less fully. So the philosophical project, I think, at St. John's is most crucial. But as a result of the questions that the moderns raise, one has to ask about the validity of the scientific project in particular, because that becomes the actual fruit. That's the direct. That's the thing that we've really inherited from this new founding, and when you go as you go through the modern scientific authors, you are forced to question the philosophical certainty of something like the calculus. I mean, it's founded on these ideas about infinitesimals that make one wonder about whether you can actually justify using a concept like the infinite in something as concrete as mathematics. And that question doesn't entirely go away. So within mathematics, there are questions that open up about again the validity of what is being suggested and the ways of looking at the world. And as a result of that, there's also the question of whether what's being given is simply an account that explains the phenomenon from a human perspective, or whether it's actually something that gets at the truth of what a being actually is.